So Biotech happened and I got right into it. Straight away I'll say I think it's a great expansion that very elegantly works a lot of the basic concepts of some of the more popular mods into the vanilla experience. And I probably don't need to run down the features of the DLC for you, but in case you missed it, the three headliners are player-controlled mechanoids, genetically diverse colonists, and of course alongside that, breeding. It's pretty easy to experience all of these in a single playthrough, which is what I'll be doing here. So I chose the Sangrophage scenario where you start with two colonists. One Sanguophage, which is a vampire by the way, and what I guess is their Thrall that they continually promise to turn into a Sanguophage but then never do, like Guillermo in What We Do in the Shadows. So anyway, in this scenario, Nandor is called Sanguinius and is a very general colonist, while Guillermo is called Ralderon, who's good at crafting, mining, plant work, and is a cannibal. That's just how we do things here. The two of them are following the ideology of the Revenant Legion, which is a reference I hope will land. Anyway, it's a pretty powerful ideology combining transhumanism and tunneler to create the ultimate gang of cave-dwelling weirdos. We settled along the spine of the Green Needle Mountains in a boreal forest, sporting an average temperature of 3 degrees C. Nippy. Now, we've got quite a lot to do, and starting with just two colonists, it's going to take a while to kick into gear, so let's not dwell too much on the early game. You've seen me do this before anyway, so I think I'm good to just cover the highlights. Being tunnelers, we burrowed right into the face of the mountain and got the basics set up. A small barracks with a space to eat, a very small prison cell for anyone unfortunate enough to survive the wrath of Sanguinius, a reasonably sized fungus farm, and a large fridge to go along with it. In the initial few raids, Sanguinius demonstrated one of the early game problems with the Sanguophages. They're extraordinarily adept at killing people, which would be helpful if they didn't rely on the hemogen, which apparently only flows through the veins of a living victim. They're no use to us dead. They're so good at killing people, in fact, that when we had a pig person arrive as a refugee, who I thought would make the perfect long-term blood bag for Sanguinius, he killed him in a social fight. Just straight up beat him to death with his fists. Mechanically speaking, this happens because of the Xenogene for strong melee damage, which applies a 150% multiplier to their damage, which, again, is a very strong and mostly beneficial trait, except for when it isn't. Like when you're trying to take prisoners to turn into nuggets and milk for hemogen. Anyway, for a change I decided to accept the Deserter quest and make enemies of the Empire. For the trouble I got Comnena, Byzantine historian and daughter of the Emperor Alexius Comnenus. Wait, no, that's not her. This Comnena is a nervous psychopath with an annoying voice. Google says it's pronounced Comnini, but I've been saying Comnena in my head this whole playthrough, so that's what I'm sticking with. Something else Sanguinius can do very well is leap. He do be jumping. Jumping right into the windows of unsubscribed viewers last I heard, so, you know, just a suggestion. I did install a few mods by the way, but just basic stuff, nothing really game-changing. I've constantly been annoyed by not being able to see moods at a glance, so I installed the color-coded mood bar mod. And I wanted to make this colony with a very distinct aesthetic, which standing lamps just weren't going to work for, so I installed the good old wall lights mod. And as well as Camera Plus, because I wanted to really get right in there. I don't think I'd ever actually run this mod on my own. I like the standard camera bounds, but for making these videos, it's very good. Anyway, back to the story. Comnena joined and I needed to convert her to our ideology or she'd go mad living in a tunnel and eating paste. But with only 2 followers in the colony, I had to do that by imprisoning her, which means for quite a while we'd be back down to 2 colonists. Comnena isn't alone though. I finally took someone alive from a raid to serve as Sanguinius' personal feed bag. Sanguophages need to constantly top up their hemogen bar to be able to use their cool and fun abilities, and also to prevent them from being really pissy when it reaches 0. We'll get into some really awful war crimes later on with this, but for now I just keep this person in a cell and feed on them whenever required, which they don't love, but it could be worse. Much worse. A little later on, halfway into winter in fact, we got to see one of Biotech's most anticipated features. Animal people. And we killed them. After which I took a rewarded combat quest which would see a pair of Impid archers attack for 2 masterworks, a revolver and a bed. Both very nice, just in extremely different circumstances. So, if I may draw your attention to 2 of the colony's prisoners here. Sniff and Nerve. Noive? Nerve? Whatever, their names really don't matter. They're the first of the colony's permanent, unwilling residents. Most of you degenerates will already know this, but for the rest of you, in Rimworld you can't just directly remove a prisoner's legs. But you can fit them with wooden stumps and then remove those, which achieves the same end result. Normally I'd call these flesh nuggets, but given what we're using them for, blood bag feels more appropriate. Nove is occupying this nice room right now, which is kind of insulting considering they couldn't get out of bed if they wanted to. I'll make them rooms more appropriate for their position later. A little while on, we finally re-recruited Comnena after her re-education therapy. And at about the same time we recruited Eustace, who crashed in a transport pod and miraculously didn't die, given that he's a genie. A xenotype essentially engineered to be good at crafting and research at the expense of physical robustness. This trait was demonstrated when we were set upon by a large herd of man-hunting snow hares. And there's a very obvious Monty Python and the Holy Grail joke in here, so here it is. Look, we're even hiding behind the rocks like they are in the scene. Don't worry, he's fine. I should probably remember to keep someone else in front of him though going forwards. Moving on, whilst digging out the space for the temple, named the Font of Blood by the way, very gothic, we discovered this nice little open space, a grotto of sorts, which is a useful space to have as well as looking pretty cool. Speaking of looking cool, these two large rooms here are shaped like blood drops. I mean, they don't look like anything else of course, certainly nothing with a flared base designed for rectal insertion. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page regarding how they're shaped like blood drops and how that's edgy and dark and gothic. They're not butt plugs. So, moving even further on, one of the future blood bags went berserk, so Sanguinius opened the door, got on the floor, and then everybody did the dinosaur? Wait, no, that's not what happened. Sanguinius just beheaded him, which was awkward, but looking back, they never would have worked as a blood bag anyway. They are, or rather were, a waster, which is the xenotype which requires psychite just to stay alive. So this is getting properly grim, but I think the ideal blood bags are pigskins, because they can eat anything and have a strong immunity gene. But we don't need to talk about this much beyond here. The collection of hemogen farms will grow a little more, but you actually don't really need that many to sustain just a few Sanguophages. And by the way, I didn't mention how a Sanguophage can implant their genes into somebody else once every 2 years. Doing so puts the recipient into a coma for a couple of days and makes the implanter a little bit sleepy, but then they have all the benefits and drawbacks of being a Sanguophage. This effectively creates an exponential spread too, assuming you had infinite colonists, because 2 years later you'll be able to make 2 more Sanguophages and so on and so forth into the fog of time. Now, it's about time I finally went to that compound from the Deserter quest to get those neuroformers, but rather more excitingly, also nestled away in the camp was a Persona Zeus hammer. Its persona isn't great, just kill thirst, but still, that hammer will prove to be extremely useful. A wanderer joined whilst Sanguinius was on the way to that compound, named Stuart. He's a decent all-rounder, but he's a bit old, still very welcome, especially for mining. Then Comnena got her lung blown up during a raid of pig people, which was annoying, and I didn't want to start harvesting from the blood bags, so I sort of just committed to having her live with a single lung until I could make or buy one of the new detoxifier lungs that were added in Biotech. The hole in the ground continued to transform from a cave into a sanctum, with a grow room taking shape lit in UV purple, and shortly after, extremely atmospheric red lighting started to go into the hallways as well. Smoothing this many walls takes a really long time, but it was starting to get done bit by bit. And thanks to having the hydroponics of course, it was also time to start painting. The hallways look really good in red. I really love this feature more than I can explain. And speaking of features, Comnena is pregnant, so I'm going to get to experience that one next. Not a whole lot happened during her pregnancy. There was a mech cluster, a very easy one to be honest, and then there was a fairly large raid of those tox folk, which made me realise I should probably build some kind of defensive structure, because standing out here in a field of rocks isn't going to just work forever. And with the baby coming, I made a little hospital and put some baby stuff in their bedroom. However, despite doing pretty much everything I could, the baby came out sick, which is annoying, but ultimately fine so long as it's treated. In honour of her current state, I named the baby Sicko. I didn't talk about death resting yet, did I? Well, it's another thing that Sanguophages do. They have to spend a few days asleep every once in a while. It comes with some bonuses provided you build various machines near their casket, and they have a limit to how many of those machines they can utilize, but that can be raised with an item that's only attainable through quest rewards or trading. Anyway, I'm bringing it up now because what usually happens is you put your big strong vampire edgelord away for his mandatory nap and then a hostile event happens. This time it was an infestation in this new chamber I had excavated out here for future use. In Sanguinius's absence, Stuart had to serve as the door guard, which I'm sure sucked for him, but it worked out okay. This is about 110 days into the playthrough. As I said earlier, it's much less cave and more like a sanctum now, but it's still got a long way to go. I know a lot of YouTubers like to do the 100 days of a colony in Rimworld and close it out there, but for me that's just far too early. I couldn't stop playing this colony here even if I wanted to. My body just simply wouldn't have allowed me to step away. This does however mean I'd best not spend too long on minor events, so as I often like to do, let's breeze through some stuff. A mech cluster landed nearby that lowered the area's temperature by 10 degrees, which isn't ideal, but we're self-sufficient in this cave, so I left it there for quite a long time. I finally built a wall and a basic funnel to murder things in, at which point I also had Sanguinius squirt his hot vampire genes all over Ralderon, putting her into a short coma before she wakes up as an edgelord vampire. I managed to take another prisoner alive and promptly removed their legs. At this point we have enough medicine production to consistently harvest hemogen packs from the prisoners, by the way, rather than just feeding on them like uncouth savages. I finally put a new lung into Comnena and then we had a flurry of raids, 4 in a row. They were mostly easily handled with the help of the turret funnel, but the last one was a bit more tricky. 2 groups of Itakin from either side of the map, one of which cut Stuart off from the base, meaning I had to send out Sanguinius and Ralderon to go help, then run them back before the other group started their attack, but as usual, it went okay, and that's all I asked for. After all that excitement, it was time for Sicko to become a child, just as toxic fallout blanketed the area. Childhood in Rimworld is dotted with growth moments, between which the child will try and perform their desired learning activity, which changes frequently and ranges from drawing scribbles on the floor, learning from an adult in the classroom, to running around in the toxic fallout getting poisoned and losing toes to frostbite. Doing these things fills their need for learning, which increases the rate their growth tier advances. The higher a child's growth tier when a growth moment comes, the more choices of traits and passions you'll get to allocate them. A child only gets 3 growth moments in total, the last one being at age 13, after which they're considered an adult. It's worth noting, by the way, that children in Rimworld by default age at 4 times the normal rate, so it actually only takes a child 3 and a bit years to reach adulthood. So now of course we're getting to the point where transhumanists will complain about not having their shiny things like neural superchargers and all that. So whenever I get some advanced components, I'll make some new bits to stick onto the colonists. I actually even put a field hand onto Ralderon here, since at this point she's the only planter in the colony and has a whole lot of mushrooms to work on. I finally sent Sanguinius to go and deal with that climate adjuster, never actually engaging the mechs there. I just broke the adjuster and ran away, because why make things harder for myself? There was a transport pod crash from which I took a prisoner named Thorn and started to convert them with rituals. They'd pretty much be a permanent researcher once recruited. And here is where I wanted to get into the mechanoid stuff too. So I grabbed the transponder out of that thing there and called down the Mechanitor's ship, killed the accompanying robots and then pulled the mech link off the desiccated skeleton, immediately screwing it into Sanguinius' skull, making him a psychic mechanoid controlling vampire. I ended a session here, and the first thing that happened when I started playing the next day was that Sanguinius and Comnena divorced, which wasn't exactly how I pictured this going in my head, but whatever, fine. Comnena kept the big shiny bedroom and Sanguinius got relegated to what actually used to be a prison cell before I made the prisoners more appropriate lodgings. The space alongside those new prison cells is for some Mechanitor stuff. Early on I'll just have a few constructors and lifters. I don't really find the early combat bots to be particularly useful, but I've still made a few to follow Sanguinius around and soak up a couple of bullets. Another transport pod prisoner dropped, Zin. She's very good if you can ignore her extremely advanced age, which I can for now, so I captured her for recruiting. And there were a few more raids between these events. A small mech raid which was slightly harder because Sanguinius was busy napping, but still pretty easy to deal with. And that was immediately followed by a large gang of Wookiees which informed me I should probably build sturdier defences, because while it actually didn't even result in much injury, it was an absolute shit show. And I remembered at this point that mechanoids do have a downside. When charging, they produce waste packs, which need to be kept frozen to prevent them from spreading pollution. So I started work converting a section of the strip mine with access to an air vent in the roof into a very large freezer. I wasn't sure how efficient this would actually be, but given how cold the region is already, it was completely fine. For a good portion of the year, I don't even need to actively cool it. We've passed over 200 days into the colony here, and I've researched advanced fabrication so that a lot more bionics can start to be made. I replaced both of Stuart's lungs, for example, to cure his asthma. I was also by this point getting seriously fed up with solar power, so I started to build tunnels out to steam geysers for geothermal power. But I wasn't the only one tunneling. A breaching mech hive raid came for me right as I planned these constructions. Having to go out and face them in the field was a touch rough, but could have gone much worse. Sanguinius got to just jump between mechs, one or two shotting them with his big shiny hammer, while the other guy stood among the corpses of the past raiders, taking a few hits, but nothing life-threatening. A gang of Imperials set up a siege just afterwards, which should probably have been a tough challenge, but Sanguinius and Ralderon made hilariously quick work of them. So long as they don't get set on fire, they really are quite overpowered. Just after that, young Sicko had her first growth moment. I got to choose 3 skills to put a level of passion into, and a trait. She got Quick Sleeper because that goes very well with both transhumanists and sanguophages, which, by the way, don't sleep much, aside from when they go into a 3-day-long nap, that is. So what are the goals at this point? The base already looks cool, it's got big evil vampire vibes, so I pretty much consider that part fulfilled. Any other work on it is just to facilitate the other stuff. I basically want to make sure Lil Sicko is raised good and proper, make some more of the colonists into vampirophages, and get into some of the more advanced Mechanitor stuff. So with that in mind, I had Sanguinius call in the first of the mechanoid threats, the Diabolus. Which, with Ralderon and Sanguinius as strong as they already are, is not a real threat. It drops a signal chip, which a Mechanitor can then study to unlock the next level of mech tech. You can also use the signal chips to make some neat Mechanitor stuff though, like this mech commander helmet that Eustace made as a masterwork for Sanguinius. It was now that Ralderon did her best impression of a got milkad all over Stuart's face and put him into that special vampire coma to give him superpowers. But anyway, about that next load of mech stuff. Firstly, in order to make the larger mechanoids, I'd need larger Mechanitor buildings. And since I had way too much fungus growing at this point, I decided to convert the original fungus farm into a large mechanoid incubation and charging room. Secondly, to produce the subcores that go into the more advanced mechanoids, I had to painfully scan people's brains. For some reason I didn't realise immediately that I could just use the meat nuggets for this and sent the colony's least useful member in for a brain scan instead, Zin. It doesn't do any permanent damage, but they don't exactly love it either. We did have another infestation here, but these really aren't worth talking about much when you have 3 near unkillable melee combat masters. You just go stand in the doorway and kill the bugs. Now, I can't help but think that all of the extra factions added in Biotech are watering down the pool of factions with too many tribal or melee-focused people, which I'm sure can either be fixed with mods or just ridiculous levels of threat scaling, but it would have been nice to have a couple of more advanced factions mixed in with the rest. A society of hussars chugging go juice with charge rifles would have been pretty terrifying. And I'm sure I'll see some really fucked up stuff coming at me the more I play Biotech, especially with mods, but that was my observation whilst playing this first colony. Back to what we were doing, which was apparently summoning another Diabolus threat, since you need more signal chips for other Mechanitor gear. And each time you summon the threat, it's a little worse. So the second time around it brought more friends, and then after that it has a shield as well as even more friends. I did this to make a bandwidth pack for Sanguinius, but then I realised it would have to replace his shield belt, which is probably much more valuable than extra mechanoids to be honest. This would make more sense if he weren't such a strong melee combatant of course, but oh well. On that note, I finally start to make some proper armour for the vampires. Marine armour mainly, of course there were various bits occasionally coming in from traders too though, like Ralderon's cool green recon helmet. And I could tell I was hitting the late game here, because I started to run out of steel. There were still a couple of chunks scattered around the map if I wanted to spend the time hauling them, but the immediate and convenient area had already been mined almost completely dry. My solution was just to start focusing on the ground scanning radar instead, to hopefully get some nice deposits of everything nearby. Sicko got to age 10 here, which is the second growth moment, and picked up a passion in melee as well as the brawler trait, because let's face it, we're making her a vampire, so she might as well get ready for it. And oh look, here comes Sanguinius now. She sort of had to become a Sanguophage. At some point she wandered into one of the traps and managed to pick up a scar on her brain that was limiting consciousness to around 50%. Another benefit of the Sangrophage xenotype is that any permanent injuries will heal over time, so long as the body part still exists. Okay, so we called in the second mechanoid boss, the War Queen, which certainly wasn't easy. It repeatedly spawns these little BB-8 looking things with guns. It left both Sanguinius and Raldoron in need of some of Stuart's hot wrist juice, because yeah, of course, Sanguophages can also quickly tend somebody's wounds with their special glands. So anyway, the Queen went down and gave up her power focus chip, which, as you might imagine, allows you to research the next level of mech tech, unlocking the subcore Ripscanner, because naturally, more complex mechanoids require more complex brains, so to get high subcores, you're gonna need to sacrifice some brains. I built this neat little robo-sacrifice chamber just in time for a group of 3 refugees to arrive. I quickly removed all of their legs and let them stew for a while, before finally turning them into subcores, which, if I wanted to, I could use to make my very own Diabolus. But, you know, at this point we're just about reaching 300 days since landing, and Sicko is all grown up, picking up psychic hypersensitivity as her final trait, and getting this sick samurai helmet, so it's probably about time to close this out. The base is by far the coolest I've made in Rimworld, and everyone in it is happy. The amount of joy I get from being able to have a very coherent colour scheme like this is something I hope you all share, because I look forward to making some really cool stuff in the future. I've still got a lot to explore in Biotech. I've been making some of my own xenotypes for streams. Link to that below, of course. And I still need to fully explore the Mechanitor stuff, but I didn't want to go all the way with that here, because to be honest, Sanguinius just doesn't make a very good one. He's a vampire, not a nerd. The footage in the background while I close this off is of the 4 vampires really ruining the days of some besiegers that came along, by the way. So whatever you do, remain indoors. I heard something about there being cloud people out there inhabiting people's minds, but maybe that was nothing. Maybe you should go outdoors. Until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.